Great. So hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's webinar on QuerySurge and flat files. My name is Bill Hayduck. I'm the CEO of RTTS, the parent company of QuerySurge. This is our fourth in a four-part series on automating your data validation and ETL testing. Each one of these webinars target time frame is 30 minutes, so we're going to try and go through them pretty quickly. We will be providing the recordings of all the sessions at the end. Eric Smythe, QuerySurge's Director of Alliances, will kick off the webinar with a short presentation of flat files and QuerySurge. Rashad Evans, QuerySurge's Director of Product Support, will be providing the demo, and Mike Calabrese, one of our Senior Solutions Architect, will be answering any questions you might have. Which reminds me, if you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into the Q&A panel. You should see that on the right. We'll answer as many questions as we can after Rashad's demo. Also, please use the chat to alert us if there's any issues or hearing the session. Thanks again for your time and participation, and now I'm going to hand it off to Eric. Eric, it's all yours.
Thank you, Bill, and thank you everyone for joining. As Bill mentioned, my name is Eric Smythe. I'm the Director of Partner Alliances for QuerySurge. I have a few slides to go over just to give you a brief overview of what QuerySurge is and talk a little bit about the topic of today, which is testing flat files, before I turn it over for our product demonstration. As Bill mentioned, this is the fourth session of our webinar series that we're conducting today, and that's flat file for data testing. So we usually start with our business case. We know that executives make critical decisions based off of their BI and analytic reports, and the assumption is the underlying data that's displayed in these reports is accurate, but we know that's not always the case. Bad data can be introduced into the architecture. How does that happen? Well, as data flows from its initial source into data warehouses, data marts, data lakes, data migration projects, and ERP systems, anytime data is moving from one system to the other in the architecture, there's a possibility of bad data being introduced, and that's what QuerySurge does, helps automate the testing of the data as it moves through your system. We position QuerySurge as the smart testing solution for automated validation and testing of data. Our use cases are listed here: data warehouse testing, big data testing, DevOps and continuous testing, data migration testing, BI report testing, as well as enterprise app and ERP testing. QuerySurge has over 150 customers in 30 different countries. You can see some of the customers listed here. One of the things I always like to point out is you can take a look at some of the customers. It really spans across all different vertical markets, and all these different organizations chose QuerySurge as their solution for automating the testing of their data. So how does QuerySurge work? We have a concept of a test, which we call a query pair. And when you design the test, you specify two endpoints, your source and target, that you're going to compare data between. Your source could be a traditional database, a mainframe, a web service, but we're going to focus today on is dealing with flat files. And then you're going to compare that source data to some type of target system, which could be a data lake, data warehouse, BI report. At the time of execution, QuerySurge will retrieve data from both your source and target. We'll bring that data into comparable result sets, and we'll look to compare every single cell of every single record. If people are doing manual testing, they can only usually test a small subset of the overall data that they're working with, but with a solution like QuerySurge, it gives them the ability to test all the different records in the tables and data sets that they need to validate. And QuerySurge will roll up all this information into analytics, reports, and graphs, and will send off automatic email notifications to give the status of any of the sets of tests that QuerySurge is running. QuerySurge has the capability of connecting to a wide variety of different data stores. We have some drivers that are embedded in our tool, but for others, you can simply bring them into QuerySurge, download them from the vendor's website, and then they're available for any of the tests you create. And as we mentioned earlier, we're going to be focusing on dealing with flat files today and some different types of files that you may run across in your data testing journey. So when dealing with files, you're going to encounter some basic challenges that most companies will run into. One is they're comprised of many different formats. So if you need to validate data from JSONs to XMLs to Excel documents to Parquet files, you need a way to kind of uniformly structure the data so they're able to compare the information. Another challenge is that these data files can have different nested layers. So similar to a tree structure, you could have data that's 4 or 5 different layers down in that tree. And then how do you take that data and compare it to another data set that might have a completely different structured layer? And another issue is also dealing with where these files live. Can you access them in order to do the data comparison? So the goal is to have a solution in place that can easily compare and validate the data that resides in a uniformed approach, as well as be able to handle these nested complexities that some of these files will have. And of course, QuerySurge gives us the capability to reach both of those goals. So a quick example of kind of the situation you may encounter, and this is some of what will be presented today in the demonstration. You may be dealing with a file with an XML format, and you can see this particular XML document deals with orders, and the information here is structured for having a record for every single order, and the tags are focused on that. We also have a JSON file, and you'll see the JSON also has nested layers, but this is organized differently. This JSON file is organized by customers, and then the orders are a subset of the overall customers that you're dealing with. So if I needed to compare information between these two different file types, we need a way to kind of align the data between where it resides in the XML document to where it resides in the JSON. And you can see this can get pretty complex. This is a pretty simple example. But what QuerySurge does is it gives us the ability through the querying to be able to bring back the data from these files into a uniformed result set that allows us to easily compare information across all different file types. So with that, I'd like to now transition the session over to Rashad Evans. He is going to be performing today's product demonstration. So take it away, Rashad.
Thank you, Eric. I will be sharing my screen just momentarily. All right, wonderful. Thank you for joining today's webinar. My name is Rashad Evans. I am the Director of Product Support for QuerySurge. For the demonstration portion today, I will be discussing how you can leverage QuerySurge in order to test these flat files. Just a little bit of background of QuerySurge. I know Eric touched on it a little bit, but I want to give you some baseline information so you can understand how we're going forward. QuerySurge is a web-based application. So when you install it in your environment, it allows you to access it in a distributed manner, and users can log into QuerySurge from any location that has network access to it. Once a user has logged in, they'll be greeted with what we call our data analytics dashboard, and it gives you insight into your testing initiatives. There are 4 main modules within QuerySurge: the design library, and there are bottom navs here that will allow you to navigate to each of these modules, as well as top navs that allow you to get to the menus within each module. But the design library is where you'll be doing a lot of your heavy lifting. This is where you'll be creating your main testing asset. The scheduling module, which is the scheduling module, which is the second module, which will allow you to put those testing assets on the queue for execution. The third is the run dashboard, allows you to view those executions in real time and take a look at your data sets and your result sets as they return from the execution. And then finally, the fourth module is the data intelligence reporting module. This allows you to view and generate reports based off of your testing initiatives and results. There's one last module here. It's the administration module. This will allow you to do things like set up email notifications and take or perform most administrative tasks within QuerySurge. But today's topic, we are going to be creating and running a query pair against flat files. And the 2 flat files that Eric had mentioned were XML files as well as JSON files. So I'm going to show you some examples of those and how QuerySurge can address those particular use cases. Now, a query pair is our main testing asset. It's essentially defined as a pair of queries, one that's issued against a source data store, one that's issued against a target data store, both performing comparisons against the data stores. And then QuerySurge will do an analysis with those result sets and surface any resultant discrepancies that it may find between those result sets. Here we have a folder with our test query pairs. And if I were to open one, you'll see that there is a left-hand source side as well as a right-hand target side. So what do we do when we're trying to compare or query against these flat files that have these different types of structures? Well, unlike regular databases, it's not as easy to set up connections to these flat files or these data sources because they're not in tabular format as a database management system would be like your Oracles and your SQL servers of the world. JSONs and XMLs and other flat files can have different formats that can make it a little bit challenging to pull data from them and then compare them to the other data sources with which you need to compare them. Today, we're going to be using CData's drivers. They provide drivers for flat files that are a very robust solution for different types of sources and different file types. So in this case, we have an example of, on our left-hand side, a little bit more fleshed out than what our slide deck shows, of an XML file that contains just about 100,000 different records. And you can see it's an orders document. And then each record contains order information as well as the customer information, and then whether or not that that order is going to be shipped and what that ship date is going to be. Similarly, on the right-hand side, we have a JSON file that has a similar number of records, but as Eric mentioned, it's formatted much differently. The top level node is for customers, and then you have some customer information, and then within that, you have all of the orders for that particular customer. So how do we get a one-to-one relationship between the records on the source side, meaning the XML file, versus the records on the target side? This is where our query pairs come in. You will set up a query pair in QuerySurge. On the, again, source side is the XML file, and then on the target side, you'll see the JSON file. And what you will do is you will set up your connection using the CData driver with some particular information that they have documentation on, but it makes it a lot easier to pull the data from these files. In this case, on both sides, what you see is general ANSI SQL. So it's not a particular type of language that you have to understand in order to issue queries against these data sources. You use regular SQL against these data sources, making it a lot easier for our testers and our developers to get in here and use this tool. So what we want to do is, once we've set up our query pair with our connection and our query, we're going to move to the Design Time Run tab that allows you to do one-off executions, and we're going to click the Run button. And generally, whenever you're running a test in QuerySurge, what it does is it brings up a summary of where you are in the execution. It tells you whether your source or your target has executed. It tells you after the source and target execution whether your analysis is complete, and it gives you some additional information like when it's scheduled. As of right now, both of our source and target queries are running in the background. Once they've completed, the analysis will then initiate, and once the analysis initiates and completes, what we'll see momentarily is that we'll get a summary information or summary page of information about our execution. On the top, you'll see the number of rows that were returned for the source and the target. In this case, we had 100,000 rows on the source, as I mentioned before, but on the target, we only had 99,997. It gives us a little bit more detail about what those differences are. We had 3 row count differences, as obvious by the numbers that come back from the source and the target. But amongst those differences, we had 1 failed row count and 3 non-matching rows. And I'll tell you that in just a moment. What's nice here is you get the query performance graph. And these drivers are quite robust in that they give you great performance. For 100,000 records, it only took about 10 seconds on the source and about 10.5 seconds on the target to pull back for a non-database source. And then the analysis portion just took about 9 seconds, giving us about 23 seconds execution period. So what we will do here is take a look at our results, and our results will typically open up to our source page. And what you're going to see is the data that we originally had in our XML format on the source side and on our JSON format on the target side has now come back in QuerySurge in tabular format. And that's what these drivers allow you to do. They allow you to issue these queries to bring back the data in tabular format using ANSI SQL so that testers and people familiar with SQL will have the capability to easily jump in and run their tests against these different types of sources, that being flat files. So here you can see on the source, the data result sets that came back were in a tabular format, and the result sets for the JSON file also came back in a tabular format here. If we look at the failures based off of what we saw on the summary page, what we saw is that we had 3 records that were non-matching rows, meaning rows that were found on either the source or the target side, but matching rows were not found on the other. In this case, we had 3 records, as indicated by these yellow flags, that were found on the source but not found on the target, which means when we did our process from ETL process from XML to JSON, these 3 records did not make it over for some reason. And then this last record is a data failure, as indicated by the red flag here, showing that we did have a record that matched based off of our key here, but there was a member within that record, a cell here, at least one that had failed. So it immediately draws your attention as to where your failures are. So this really operates as any other data source, whether it be a relational database management system or something else as a normal database, but it converts those different formats into tabular formats here. So what we've seen here in this particular example is that we had a pretty straightforward XML setup here and a pretty straightforward JSON setup here. Well, what happens if we have a more complex type of document structure? In this case, we have some nested nodes within our XML. It's the same orders type of information. However, we have a bunch of orders, and within those parent order nodes, we have a few child nodes. We have the order date, we have the customer, which also have child nodes. We have the product child node, which has its own child nodes as well. And then on top of that, some of these nodes also have attributes. So how do we deal with that? Well, this CData driver certainly allows you to deal with that as opposed to a flat type of XML file here. In this case, what it does is it allows you to define what your starting nodes are for your queries, meaning you can essentially create virtual tables based off of the nodes that you specify in the configuration of this particular connection. In this case, I set up the order as a table, I set up customer as a table, and I set up product as a table so that we can query against them as well. So if we move to our second example, what we'll see here is that we have a database, an Oracle sales database on the source side. And our workflow in this case is that we are exporting the data from our database tables, and it's not just one table, it's multiple tables, as you can see here, into an Excel document that we need to pass on to downflow systems in our ETL workflow. So in this case, we want to test, is the export process working as we expected? So we'll be running a query against an Oracle database on the source and the XML that I just showed you that is nested on the target. As that's running, I just want to make mention that you don't have to run these only on local file systems. You can run against files that are located on distributed or cloud-based systems as well, such as Azure Data Lake, Azure Blob Storage, Amazon S3 buckets, and the like. There are capabilities to connect directly to those systems and then find and source out those files that you're looking to test and test them in those remote locations as well. So it gives you a lot of options here. So again, once our test has completed its execution, what will happen here is that we can take a look at the results. And it's a very similar thing that we saw to the previous execution. The database execution obviously will come back in tabular format, but again, now we're able to bring back tabular data from a very nested with attributes XML file. So not only can we do it with simply structured XML and JSON files, but more complex and nested files, and bring back the data as necessary. And if we take a look at the query on the target side, you can see our virtual tables are here. So what we've been able to do is essentially write a query that we would similarly write on a database management system here for the actual XML, because we have virtual tables. In this case, we have the order virtual table, and we're joining the product table, virtual table, to that order table in order to get the information for this particular query. So it is quite robust in its capabilities for simple files as well as with more complex files that you see here. And again, this is not XML and JSON are more complex type of files, but there are different types of files that these flat file connectors can work with. You can work with delimited files, such as comma separated or pipe separated files. You can work with fixed width files that typically come out of mainframe type of situations and run the same type of testing against those file systems as necessary. So this was just a quick look into what QuerySurge offers in terms of testing flat files that can be pretty simple in nature to the more complex type of flat files, bring them back in a situation that looks very familiar to you from a database testing perspective, as the tabular data will come back. And so you can test these non-traditional data sources in your workflow as necessary, depending on your need. So I just want to thank you for allowing me to showcase this quickly, these capabilities. This concludes the portion of this demo on validating flat files with XML and JSON. Bill?
Sorry, I was muted. Thanks, Rashad. Mike Calabrese, our Senior Solutions Architect, is now going to answer questions. If you have any that you haven't already sent to us yet, please type them into the Q&A window, and we'll answer them as many as we can. Mike?
Thank you, Bill. Came in, and actually Rashad just addressed them at the end of his presentation, is do we support different delimiters in flat files? And the answer to that is yes. QuerySurge's connection wizard allows you to specify the specific delimiters that you would see in your different flat files that you're trying to access. The second question is if we supported fixed width flat files, and the answer to that is also yes. So similar to how we can specify the delimiters, we can specify the width of these files, and that's something you can access within QuerySurge's connection wizard. Our next question is if we can access files that are stored in a zip location, and the answer to that is yes. We actually have an article in our QuerySurge knowledge base that lays out the process steps in order to be able to do that, and that will be involving our connection extensibility feature. One of the other questions we see coming across now is, can we speak a little bit more about our CData driver and how to set up that with the schema file? So CData is one of QuerySurge's partners and offers a number of different drivers that QuerySurge can integrate with. We do have articles that specify how to work with and connect with different CData drivers. If you are interested in learning more, I suggest going and searching in the knowledge base for your specific connection on how to do that. The other question, I guess, that sort of ties into this is, can I use my own driver to connect to flat files? And as Eric mentioned in the slide deck, you can use any JDBC compliant driver to be able to connect to your files or any data source that uses a JDBC compliant driver. CData, again, being one of them, as well as any open source drivers that you may find out there in the market. Another question coming across now is, can QuerySurge test Parquet files? The answer about that is yes. We recommend in our article using Apache Drill to access these, and again, that is detailed in our knowledge base. One other question about Excel files. Excel files we can connect to. QuerySurge does come bundled with its own Excel driver, allowing you to access the data within your workbooks and workbook sheets to bring them back in tabular format, just as Rashad was demonstrating with the XMLs and JSONs. We can do the similar type of testing with Excel files as well, using our own bundled driver. I think that pretty much wraps it up for questions. If you have any more, just please put them into the Q&A window, and if we haven't got to them yet, we will definitely reply to you via email.
All right. If there's no more questions, thanks, Mike, Rashad, and Eric. That wraps up Q&A session, as Mike said. If you have additional questions, send them out to us, and we'll answer them via email. Thanks again for your time and participation. We'll also be sending a follow-up email, as we have with this whole webinar series, to you with a link to the recording and our contact information if you have additional questions. Thanks again, everyone, and have a great day.